Hi, everybody. This is Moriel Rothman-Zecher, and he is going to be reading from his newly published novel, Before All the World. Moriel Rothman-Zecher is the author of the novels Before All the World and Sadness is a White Bird, for which he received the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35 honor, and which was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the winner of the Ohio on a Book Award, a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, the winner of the Cincinnati Books by the Banks Author Award, and long listed for the Center of Fiction's first novel prize. His essays and poems have been published or are forthcoming in Barrel House, Colorado Review, The Common Magazine, Cutleaf Journal, Haaretz, The New York Times, Paper Brigade Literary Magazine, the Paris Reviews Daily, Runner's World, the Tel Aviv Review of Books, Zizava Magazine, and elsewhere. Moriel is the recipient of 2 MacDowell Fellowships for Literature, a Wallace Annenberg Helix Fellowship for Yiddish Cultural Studies, and a Bennington Writing Seminar's Donald Hall Scholarship for Poets. Moriel teaches creative writing at the University of Dayton and online through the Catapult Writing Program, and luckily for us, writers.com. Moriel, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to hear what I believe are going to be the opening scenes of your novel. Take it away.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you, everyone at writers.com for having me. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in live or later. And I'm thrilled to be here. As Sean mentioned, my novel, Before All the World, was published just a week ago on October 11th, which a friend told me recently was also the publication date of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Obviously not October 11th of recent years, but that sort of date stuck in her mind as a portentous date. So this novel follows 2 Yiddish-speaking immigrants from a fictional shtetl, a fictional village called Zitelsk in northeastern Ukraine. They are the only 2 survivors of a pogrom, an anti-Semitic massacre in their village, and the 2 of them separately make their ways to Philadelphia of the early 1930s, where they connect with Charles, who is a Black communist ghostwriter and translator, and the 3 of them navigate America's often nightmarish sexual and racial politics. And one thing to note before diving into the reading is that the book is framed as a translation. So Gittel, one of the 2 survivors of the pogrom in Zitelsk, is the author of the book, and Charles, the Black American communist and ghostwriter, is the translator of Gittel's manuscript. And then Leib is the 3rd main character. So the book orbits around the 3 of them and is also framed as a translation. And so when reading this out loud, I'll both do a voice change, and I'll also hold up my finger to mark when I'm reading a footnote. And I think that's all you need to know. One other element that I'll give a sort of a cue in for reading is I'll put my hand like this when the font is italicized and indented, which is meant to indicate the voices of the Malachim, or Leib's and Gittel's murdered siblings, who speak to each of those characters throughout the text. So this is footnotes, this is Malachim, everything else should be clear or unclear. Everything else should be music. Hawk chicken, an aftermise. And so, crickets. On his first time at crickets, Labe stood only at the edges of the room, overwatching the men, what inpiled there every Shabbos evening in Philadelphia. And what seemed to Labe not so much Americanish or even men, but rather as a single sun-warmed river, And Labe imagined submerging into this ever-moving clamor of bodies and finding there only quiet, and he felt the surges of his taive urge and urge and urge, as Walt would have it, and wanted for his taive to merge into one of the many mouths of the cricket's river, of grasping and stroking and drinking and howling and gasping and trumpets and smoke, but found no such opening, and so remained cornersome and dryish, and he waited until Crickets began to fold into itself and become, in preparation for the 6 days of the week what followed, once again a place of nothingness, an emptyish building, or perhaps a sock shop, and then Labe to home went alone. On his second time at Crickets, a part of the river off trickled to Stip, fuck, Labe in the back room, and the gold band on the ring finger of this man's hand was cold against the skin near Labe's opening, as this man, what was really only made from water, ready to inslide into Labe, and Labe was for a gathering of moments become gebenched, blessed. With electrish Americanish upfilledness and an away feeling, and quiet. On his third time at Crickets, Labe met Charles. Sehr angenehm, baby. Ich glaub nicht, dass die ganze Welt ist cheshich. I do not believe that all the world is darkness. Labe quieted to himself. After passing under the door's lintel, not recalling from where precisely came this phrase, feeling only the way it slightly settled the dust which rose in him with each breath. And a good evening to you, Naya Fegele, said a man what had just in-walked after Labe, and was up-draping his coat on the coat rack. He off-took his hat and toward-tipped it to Labe. Despite having by this point passed most of his years in the belly of the Golden Medina, Labe remained eternally green beast newcome, and so had failed to develop a fluent comprehension of modernische, Amerikanische eugenics. Labe knew only to sense Jew or Goy by just opening his nostrils, and so, nostrils flared, Labe did right away sense that the man what had in-walked just behind him was not a Jew, lacking, as his scent was, in that particular underhum of mashed seven fish. You're knowing to speak Jewish? Labe said in American. Don't look so verwundert, said the man. I'm not surprised from anything, Labe said. Only, I wanted to tell you that Fegele just is meaning bird. You don't say, said the man, upraising only one of his eyebrows. Labe searched the drawers of his chest for a shtickle of unjewsome American, what he might place on his tongue. I do say? Labe said. All right, Newbird, the man said, placing his hat among the 16 or 20 other hats. How about you buy me a drink to make up for any potential iniquities? A big pine cone like you must have a few extra rubles. The man touched a hand to his belly. And I ought to be able to scrounge up a pound of flesh, just in case. Labe did not laugh. He was then only looking upon the man's fingers, what were stained with ink, and what were neatly up-scrolling the sleeves of his shirt, and at the soft dance of tendons in the man's naked becoming forearms, and inside Labe, his tie-vis stretched and scratched at the back of his eyes. Somewhere else in the main room of Crickets, someone screamed, maybe with laughter, maybe without. Lighten up, kid, the man said, searching for Labe's eyes with his eyes. Labe nodded, looked at the man's eyes, looked away. I should introduce myself more properly. I'm Charles, Charles said, outstretching his hand. Fellow traveler of Red Emma, stuck in the tower of our very own city hall, which is to say, new boy, I'm on your side if you're on mine. Labe removed his hand from his pocket, leaving a film of moisture on the coins therein, wet beating on the metal like dew on the Rebbe's iron gate in the mornings of Zatelsk's late summer. But the gates can rot from the hairs from the longest Rebbe beard outfall next to the way what dewdrops clung to the fingers of pine. Remember, Labele, and grasped Charles' hand with his hand. Charles's palm was dry and warm, and Labe ran his mind over the feeling of Charles's hand, over brushing his cheek and then grasping the back of his neck and sliding down his back and toward pulling him inward to where there would be softness and hardness alike. And then the mustful bar, which was not really a bar, which was really just a den of tin and furnace smoke and coagulated dreams, began to feel once more unto Labe as a river. On that note, did you hear that Comrade Goldman might be allowed back for a second crack at the city of brotherly love later this year? Oh, Labe said, not caring much this way or that from the second coming of M.K. Goldman, or from brothersome fissures in the city of love. Anyhow, Charles said, how about that drink? Labe had heard the Halpers saying that the blacks, originally Schwarze, much as I would like to take Labe and Gittel at their word regarding their overheard suggestion that this term might be deployed without malice, both lived experience and literary extrapolation serve to undermine said claim. Even if Schwarze is not identical to the word upon which America was founded, and which it continues to wield in order to undergird the brutalization, exploitation, and racialized class stratification requisite to sate its various capitalistic and cannibalistic appetites, the term is grotesque and hateful enough in its own right. We're very much poor, more poor than even the poor Jews of Philadelphia. So he took his Dewey rubles, what he had actually very few, and moved toward the barman, what had around his neck a horizon blowish tie, and hair what was painted strawish. Behind him perched a squat row of bottles, mauve, dim, taupe, dappled jasmine, aquamarine, reddish clear. Charles put his fingers to Labe's shoulders and said something to the pretty barman in rhymesome American. Tabulate it, Nate. The barman blinked with one of his eyes, then shook his head at Labe's palm full of coins and passed 2 glasses of blood. It's wine, Labele. It's just wine. Across the bar, and Charles took them without giving to the barman any money soever. Labe in-breathed one breath through his nose, away took 1 glass from Charles's hand, down drank half its contents in one schluck. Around them the night was savage, was soft, was a strumming slipping between alternately steady and swaying sweating forms, was streaks of silver threaded through earlobes, was the stab of fish hooks coddled into jowls, was outjutting sexes, was lost, was startling itself, was just another Shabbos evening at cricket's. Drinks have gotten so goddamn expensive, Charles said. Labe tried to raise one eyebrow onto Charles, but could not alone raise each of his 2 brows, as could his interlocutor, and so got stuck looking more wry than wry. Charles drew from his own pocket a metal case, and from the case 2 paper-wrapped bone fingers of tobacco. Things were better, in a sense, Charles said, before America's noble experiment expired, the hooch's taste notwithstanding. Most of the erstwhile blind tigers seem to have had no trouble finding their eyes in this new era, and even though we're still underground, Crickets has been upping its rates to keep pace, but I suppose so go the workings of capital, hey? I suppose, Labe said, and took a cigarette from Charles and placed it between his teeth, feeling his taive rushing within him as Charles placed a hand over Labe's hand and lit Labe's cigarette with another metal box, this one smaller and toward pointing a steady finger of fire to the ceiling, what could not be seen for all the smoke filling the room, but what Labe believed to be there nevertheless. Charles lit his own cigarette, blew out a pillar of smoke, and spoke. Did you ever make it to a blind tiger, new boy? Labe nodded, then shook his head, then tilted his head to the side. A speakeasy. Labe, what didn't know from speaking easy, certainish notly in American, shrugged, his teeth resting on the cigarette's end. The thing is, Charles said, those speakeasy kittens weren't concerned in the least with who was fucking whom, given that we were all fucking America together, as it were. Suddenly, though, the bulk of the populace seems to have worked itself up into such a state of confusion regarding our so-called sodomitical sodality, which they seem to have somehow deemed both non-existent and supremely threat. Watch it with that thing, baby. Labe's tongue had been circling the end of his cigarette, and its ashen beginning had grown longer and flimsier, the various embers attached by only the faintest threads of paper and dried plant. Ashtray, Nathaniel? Charles said to the barman, who also withdrew from the underbar a ridged and hollow thing, what could not have been a shell of a smallish turtle, but what looked to Labe to be, and Charles held it out for Labe, and Labe rim-tapped his cigarette, and half of it fell into the empty shell where it glowed reddish and lonesome, and all 3 men watched it until it receded fully into darkness, and Charles replaced the shell on the bar and coughed, and the barman resumed his ritual of rummage and rustle, and Labe chewed the flesh on the inside of his cheek. Don't worry, though, Charles said. They haven't raided Crickets yet, and we're already, what is it now, a couple of weeks into this new era. So I figure we're all right here until we're not. Labe nodded, had not been so much listening to what Charles was saying, had been instead coaxing his taive to continue its prowl of his skin, his nape, his sex, his memories, his eyes, as Charles away went into his own words world. Labe down drank another schluck. So, wie heißt du anyway, kid? Labe. Labe, Charles said. Lion, yes? It's meaning lion, yes, Labe said, drinking more and wiping his wrist on his mouth's edges, feeling his lips overbrush his own arm, wanting for them to overbrush wanting then to overbrush his lips on Charles's arm, wanting for Charles's lips to overbrush his face, wanting another moment of quiet and breath. Would it be all right if I call you Lion? It's all right, Labe said. All right then, L'chaim, Lion, Charles said, and he moved his glass toward Labe's, but stopped short, and Labe saw that his own glass was empty, and he watched as Charles signaled to the barman and down drank the rest of his own blood, and then suffocated the remainder of his cigarette in the burgundy droplets congregated at the bottom of the glass, placed the soggish remnant in the bar-resting ash turtle, retrieved the 2 drinks from the barman with an eye blink of his own, and then handed a second glass to Labe, their fingers touching. Oh, Sorish, oh, stay. Let's try that again, Charles said. Toward strength, Labe. Glass clinked against glass amidst the smoke. Labe's own cigarette had burned down into a single ball of fire, which was dancing a frantic Yontif red letter day dance near his fingertips, and Charles licked his own forefinger and his center finger and also his tongue, and toward reached to Labe's mouth, and clamped his wetted, ink-stained fingers around the fire, and it sizzled and was gone, and Charles's body was now close to Labe's, and somewhere else in crickets someone howled again, and Labe still stayed and then forward swayed slightly as Charles retreated 1 half step. How old are you, Lion? 20 almost? Well, Charles said, I guess if I'm any sort of bird, that makes me a chicken hawk. What? Don't worry about it. How old are you? I'll be 33 in April, Charles said. Just how old Mamashi was. You're the best chess player in all of Zitelsk. You okay, Lion? Why should I not be? Because you're a hawk chicken? Charles laughed. Labe put his glass to his lips and drank again, hardish, longish, longing for the before moment of Taiva to return and to banish the moments of his Mamishi and Zanvil and Sprinzel, what moments he did not wish to hold or be held by now or ever again. Yo, but that's not true, Labele. Cannot be true, Labele ours. Hey, Charles said, upbringing his fingertips to Labe's cheek. I didn't mean to laugh at you, Lion. Tell me if you want me to go and I'll go. You'll have your pick of the litter in here tonight, I'm sure of it, with big, sad eyes like those. Labe was silent. Well, Charles said, I was glad to make your acquaintance. Zeir Eingenim, baby, and thanks for getting me these drinks. No, Labe said, pushing the word past the desiccated grapes, coating the tunnel of his throat, through the breath upfilling his body. Charles looked at Labe, one eyebrow upraised. I have not got for you the drinks, Labe said. You have got for me. You've got a point there, Lion, Charles said, his eyes around searching Labe's eyes. One more? Labe nodded, waiting now at the edge of the forest, surrounded by tall grasses and a band of hedgehogs and fire ants, and there was the sound of a river, and the smell of burning small trees, and the smell of charred pages, and smoked whitefish, and the sound of the wind, and strumming and singing, Tumbala, 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 like. And then Charles returned, once more holding 2 glasses, and said, to the procreant urge of the world, as it were, Whitman, baby. Don't get too hung up on the procreant part if that's what's got you looking so far zorked. Walt would have been one of the city of brotherly love's most famous fagales, except that folks were less obsessed with fagalizing back then. Aha, Labe said. So we're come back to talking about birds. So it seems. Will you spread your wings and trip the light fantastic with me, Lion? Charles leaned his head to the back room door, from behind what bemuffled trumpet sound strained to escape. Labe nodded and followed Charles into the back room, and Charles closed the door behind them and faced Labe, and then put one hand around his waist and then the other, and Labe realized only then that they would in truth dance, and he put his arms through Charles's arms and behind Charles's back, and Charles pulled Labe toward him, and Labe let himself forward fall, and they moved together back and forth and were surrounded by other men, rocking and drink sloshing and tripping fantastisch in the smoke-dark gray light, and laughing and kneeling and whispering into one another in the almost safe, almost silence that undersat the music, in scrawny and tubbish and reaching states of dress and gentle undress. Labe pressed himself forward, and one of Charles's palms slipped up Labe's fabric-coated spine, and his fingers brushed the hairs on the back of Labe's neck. And Labe, what had never been happy, even before the forest, felt something lightsome wing between his rib cage, and he pressed his lips down onto Charles's neck, and did not away take them from there for a long time. After this long time had passed, Charles moved his hand from Labe's nape and onto the side of his face, and moved his own face downward, and then kissed Labe on his mouth. And behind the soft and sharp of Charles's kiss, Labe's mouth contorted into a dust village shape. What, if it were not obscured by the lips of this other man, and the cloud pillar of smoke and hopes inside crickets, and could be freely gazed upon by humanish eyes, might have been mistaken for an American smile. Then Labe decided to leave, thinking to himself that Jutke might grow fear-filled if he didn't return to sleep at the Helper home. Odd, and of course false though this thought-seed was, Labe let it rest in the soil of his mind, let it nibble with the roots on the mice as buried therein, and anyway Labe felt like he might become sick from approximating for longer than he was used to a sort of smile under the press of Charles's lips and the prickle of his mustache, and so he removed his lips from Charles's lips. "I will go home," Labe said, and Charles quickly off took his hands from Labe, and across his eyes in the dark there was a quick flicker of hurt before the guardedness of thickets could be back pulled, but Labe reached his hands out and caught one of Charles's away-flying hands, and he pulled it to his mouth and wanted to kiss Charles's palm, but Charles's hands were now clenched, so he kissed instead Charles's knuckle, and then down bit on Charles's knuckle, not too hardish, though not too lightsome either, Lion, and looked up at Charles's eyes, and Charles withdrew his hand from Labe's mouth and closed his eyes and opened them and leaned forward and kissed Labe on his forehead. "All right then. It was good to meet you, Lion," Charles said. Labe nodded. "Will you come back next week?" Charles said. "I will come back," Labe said. "Ja, and we also, we hoped that he would." And he did. And I'll stop there.
That was wonderful, Moriel. Thank you very much. I have, many questions, and I'll lead this first part of the Q&A. Everyone else in the audience, if you have questions, think of them, and we'll have time for that later. My first, immediate impression of this is that you tell stories like a poet, and of course, you are a poet who is also a fiction writer, so that makes sense. So I would like to know how your experience of being a poet informs your process of writing fiction. There's so much play with language and rhythm and tension in the way that you're telling stories that are clearly informed by also being a poet. And I'm wondering how the skill from one kind of translates to the skills that go into writing fiction.
Thank you for that question. So a story just came to mind as I thought of that. I remember once my sister-in-law, my brother's partner, who is a magnificent storyteller, um, was starting to tell a story, and and someone interrupted her and said, "Oh, no, I think you've told me this one before." And she kind of looks at them and said, "Wait, do you think that the purpose of a story is for me to communicate information?" And I love that idea, and I love that moment. I feel like I was almost there. I've heard that story a number of times. I feel like I was almost sitting in the room. I could hear the laughter that follows, the kind of sigh of relief, this this release from the frantic progression of of the notion that language is only there to communicate approximate information. Language is only there to get a point across. Language is only there as sort of a utilitarian vehicle on which we might place whatever concept or directive we have in our mind or our heart or our politics and send it forward, and hopefully the vehicle reaches its destination. And I think what poetry reminds for me again and again, and has for all of my adult life and also before, is that the purpose of language is not only a vehicle to take us from one place to another. It is a pool in which we might immerse ourselves. It is a mountain which we might scramble up and then scramble back down again. It's a circle in which we might spin and spin and spin and see if we're a little bit different once we've spun 4 or 6 or 1,800 times. And for me, for both of my novels, this is my second book, and for both of my novels, um, poems, in particular poems, were the starting points of the novels. Um, I I've spent more hours writing novels and certainly more hours reading novels than I have poetry. But poetry stands at the kind of, yeah, I think unreachable ultimate point of written art for me. It's this unreachable pinnacle, which poetry doesn't reach, right? Poetry never reaches poetry's pinnacle. And I think about, Marianne Moore's famous short poem called Poetry. I too dislike it, but yet when read with a perfect contempt for it, one may find in it, after all, a place for the genuine. And so poetry never reaches poetry, but I think actually a lot of times poetry, um, this this sounds like a tautology, and so I'll allow the words to kind of mix among each other and not necessarily have a clear and academically sound point to make. Poetry gets closest to poetry out of all the written arts, or it might, right? Poetry might get closest to poetry, um, and I think in some ways this novel isn't a poem, right? It's not a book length poem, and it very much is a novel that owes its form and its structure and its obsession with storytelling, um, to the form of the novel more than the form of the poetry. But it seeks to position itself on that same mountain, on that same scrabbly hill that is reaching toward that ultimate pinnacle, which is poetry, um, which is hard to define. And I once in a recent class, the one part of my bio that you read that should be updated is I'm now teaching at University of the Arts in Philadelphia rather than University of Dayton in Ohio. Um, and I asked my students if they might define poetry, and one student who is a dancer um, said, "I think poetry is like this," and he did that kind of shape with his hand. And so that was quite moving to me to see a sort of physical definition of poetry. Poetry is quite hard to define, but whatever it is that is sitting on top of that sort of mountain of words and sounds and consonants and syllables and the clash of different letters in our mouths and in our ears and in our eyes. Um, this novel is certainly throughout its pages reaching toward the place of poetry, even as it is ultimately allegiant to the thing of the novel, to the sort of the task of the novel.
I love that answer. I think that, well, first of all, I think that you could write an entire thesis based on that answer alone. And I also think that I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours based on everything you just said, and I'm going to try really, really hard not to do that. But one thing that struck out to me was something you said about how language is not just something meant to convey information, which of course I love hearing that. I think that that's a quirk particularly of the English language, and like people who are monolingual English speakers sort of use English as just a way to like convey information, right? It's a language of business. It's a language
Emails.
of email. Yeah. It's this like lingua franca that, like, the world is like attuned to, and it's very, it's capitalist, it's colonialist, etc., etc. I'm curious um how your knowledge of Hebrew and Yiddish also inform your storytelling, because those are languages that are very lyrical, they're very emotional, and I think they capture more of that sensibility of not just conveying information.
Beautiful. Yeah. And in both novels, so my first novel, Sadness is a White Bird, um, that book weaves through Hebrew and Arabic, and not only in the kind of gestural sense, but also in the literal sense that the text itself contains a lot of transliterated Hebrew and Arabic. And in this book, even more so. Um, there's a Hebrew phrase that came to mind right now, alachat kama v'kama. And what I love is actually, it doesn't matter if a single person here knows what those words mean. Something about the sound of that phrase, I think, conveys its meaning. Alachat kama v'kama. And what it means is all the, in this case, all the more so. And so with this book, Alachat kama v'kama, um, this book is not only woven around Yiddish, but in some ways it seeks to draw from the Yiddish syntax, draw from Yiddish sounds, draw from Yiddish logics and Yiddish rhythms and Yiddish linguistics, and also to make up things. There are points where the book takes total flights of fancy, where the translator, Charles, takes absolute liberty, invents words that don't have any kind of um, legitimate basis in the Yiddish language. Other points where there are full paragraphs that are drawn from sort of back translations and everything in between. But I think that a there is there is something, there is something significant about the sounds, whether or not the reader has any foreknowledge of Yiddish, whether or not the reader knows a single word of Yiddish. Everyone knows a single word. Everyone knows, schmuck,
Chutzpah.
chutzpah, exactly, schmuck and chutzpah. But whether you have just those two words or another 15, 30,000 words, I think there is something to be gained just by allowing your eyes or your ears or your lips to form the sounds of the sentences. And I think that for me is an offering I make in this text by de-italicizing every non-English word. So there's this convention, and I think the convention is starting to fray, but there has been this convention of italicizing in English language novels all non-English language transliterated or words that come from other languages, even if they are written in Latin script. And for me, I know as a reader, that to me is a signal of inessentialness, of less importance, of, if we go back to this hierarchy, this sort of hierarchy of English as the world conquering um, superior language in a sense, then of course all those little scrabbly languages italicized are going to be noted to the reader as, skip over it. Either the author will be dutiful and offer to you a word for word translation, so you'll get the meaning, right? The meaning will be transported to you on the utilitarian train of the English language, or um, it'll be skipped, and in which case you didn't need it. And I think one of the offerings I hope to give to readers, and of course I have no control over how someone reads, which is one of the terrifying gifts of publishing a book, is that actually most people won't hear me give any kind of talk about anything, and it'll just be an interaction between the reader and the text. It's mostly a gift, and it's a little terrifying. But the offering is that the reader can take a few more moments with these words that they may have never seen before, and they can glance down into the footnote and see that ich glaub nicht as die ganze Welt is cheshech. They can see that means I do not believe that all the world is darkness. And from then on, perhaps they can just translate in their mind next time they see that phrase, or they can see what it feels like to move their mouths around the sounds. And will they pronounce it right? Who cares? Will they have any familiarity with any of the words? Who cares? For me, it's much more important that the sounds be present for the reader, because I think the sounds are not necessarily subordinate to what they mean. Or that there's not this clear hierarchy for me, and this is again drawing from poetry very clearly and very directly. There's not this clear hierarchy for me that what a word means is more important than what it sounds like. And I will also say that even as we've been kind of ragging on the English language, I love a lot of English language poetry, and I love the sounds of the English language when it's put in sort of the right order, and I love some of the ways that poets can and have shaped the English language. And I saw in the text there was a sort of a nod to Shakespeare, and I certainly agree with that. I love Shakespeare. I love and most of my reading has been done in English. I speak 5 languages, but I read mostly in English, and I love the English language. It's not I'm not writing in English by accident either. I mean, I think I'm quite moved by Jhumpa Lahiri's project of writing only in Italian, and I could do that too. I could write only in my second or third or fourth or fifth language. It would come out differently, but I choose to write in English because I think there is actually a lot of stunning poetics to be wrought from the English language, to be chipped away. If you chip away at this kind of transactional Gmail surface of the English language, I think there actually can be some pretty stunning poetics to be found in the sounds of this tongue. Um, and the hope in this project was to sort of see what comes out when this tongue and its sounds are combined with another tongue, one which has been mostly reviled and exiled into the realm of who should care about Yiddish? Probably just Jews, and probably just Jews with Yiddish-speaking ancestors, and even they are probably embarrassed about it and will just use it as the punchline for a handful of jokes or for some kind of nostalgic memories of the good old days in the old country or whatever the case may be. And here, the primary audience is not just Jews. The primary audience is readers. The primary audience is people who are connected to the project of language and sound, who are interested in how language and sound forms our ethics, forms our way of moving through the world as human beings, in which the ways in which speaking and storytelling humanizes us and asks us to humanize ourselves and humanizes the people we are speaking to and hearing when we actually do it with sort of with open hearts and minds and looser tongues and stranger slanter, if I can quote Dickinson, obliquely quote Dickinson, um, slanter perspectives on language. And so one of the many projects of this book is to sort of combine these two tongues and see what results. And this is, and that sounds haphazard when I say it like that. Of course, it was, 5.5 years of combining and then recombining and moving around and changing and extracting and altering and learning. Frankly, I mean, when I started writing this book, I didn't know any Yiddish. I knew basically schmuck and chutzpah, maybe a handful of other words, but it was also a project of learning as I went. Um, and then taking a pause and getting more of the fundamentals of the language, and then traveling to Yiddish land, to where my ancestors live and where many of these Yiddish poets that I lean on lived 100 or 90 or 80 years ago. And yeah, so it was a long process, not a haphazard one, but a slant one and a tilted one and a dizzying one and a vertiginous one, and a delightful one.
I love that this project is doing what I view as being translation on multiple levels. There's the translation of Hebrew and Yiddish, and I think you mentioned Arabic words as well. But of course, not italicizing the words, presenting them as central to the story because they are. And then there's also Charles who's annotating the story and in a way translating it for the modern reader. Because so much of what you're discussing are things, central to the politics of 1930. There's all these different class struggles. There's very much racism, and there's all these sorts of things happening in the underground, right? Racism and segregation and homophobia, and of course things that we're still very much contending with today. I am curious how writing, and this is the last question I'll ask, by the way. So anybody else who has questions after, feel free to ask. My last question is, how did writing this book did writing this book teach you more about America, about your own history, about Judaism and Jewish culture? Like, what was sort of the learning process for you?
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer this question. I also see that in the chat, one of the folks asked a question about the researching and imagining of Black communist characters. And so one thing that I'll amend from your point is that actually, so at the very beginning of the book, I did skip a few of the earliest chapters when diving into this. So the first full chunk of text that appears is a translator's note by Charles, and it's signed by Charles in Moscow, 1936. So you're absolutely right that Charles is translating the text and communicating the text to an American audience or to an English reading and English speaking audience. But in his frame, he's not translating it to an audience of 2022 necessarily, but rather to his contemporaries in the mid 30s and of course onwards.
Mm.
And then, of course, there's a meta prism in which that I wasn't pretending to be living in 1936 as I was writing this. I was also writing this book. I started writing it in February 2017, right? So what is that? A number of weeks after Donald Trump was inaugurated, and was deep in the process of redrafting in May of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, and our country witnessed sort of one of the biggest uprisings for racial justice that we've seen in at least in my lifetime, um, and continued writing it onward into um, January of 2021 and summer of 2021 and the pandemic, and all of these things are present in my context, and I don't try to pretend they're not. It's not, there's not like a winking process of sort of someone might pick up this book in 100 years and say like, well, when was this written? Was it written in 1936? Like, no, it was very much written in 2020, 2021, 2022. But I think that one of the stunning things of, for me, and this is where I return to the project of what a novel is for me. Um, the novel, one of the gifts that the novel offers us is a suspension of our historical haughtiness, which is to say, a lot of times the way history is taught in school settings or is talked about in, you know, popular journalistic settings, it's taught as if we are the true sort of the ones with real vision, right? Now, from our vantage point in 2022, we can kind of look back and cluck our tongues at those, you know, ignorant people of the 1930s, or those, you know, dumb slobs who followed the communist revolution and believed in the Bolshevik dream. And we can kind of, you know, happily sit in our chair and shake our heads and say, you know, well, they ought to have known that 16 years later, many of them would be murdered in the forest, or the Jews ought to have known that they should have gotten out while they could. All of these things that are despicable and standard for how we talk about history. And the project of the novel is really to dive into any era, whether that is 5 years past or 100 years past. Um, the characters can't be subsumed to the novelist's sort of haughtiness. And at some point, they actually have to overtake the novelist, and the novelist has to want to learn from the characters rather than to teach them. It has to want to sort of follow the characters through their world rather than to instruct them with the lessons of our world. And when I do that, and this is to touch on the second question of researching and imagining Black communist characters, I found myself immersed in this astonishing era that is basically not talked about, but has so many parallels and so much to say to our current moment, right? You look at the world of 1919, and you look at a world where suddenly there is a global superpower, and I feel emotional talking about this, where there is a global superpower that says racism is a betrayal of the brotherhood of humanity. Anti-Semitism is a crime. We are going to support the Yiddish language by creating newspapers. We are going to welcome scholars and poets like Claude McKay and W.B. Du Bois, and later Paul Robeson, and many of these other great Black thinkers from the first half of the 20th century, and say these are heroes, right? These are people who should be looked to. Langston Hughes, of course. Langston Hughes spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union after being unable, and, you know, here to return to questions of screenwriting, after being unable to make it in Hollywood, being faced with such extreme racism there that no one in Hollywood was interested in looking at Hughes's screenplays. Hughes went over to the Soviet Union to write a film about American racism. Um, and of course, these are things that are not talked about in the sort of current discourse about um, any of that era, or in the current discourse of about communism, or in the current discourse about solidarity or interracial solidarity. And so getting to stand with these characters in the early 1920s, looking at the Bolshevik movement, it looks very different. Getting to stand with them in the early 1930s, it still looks very different, even though, and there are already characters here in the book and in their surroundings who are already raising alarms and raising flags, where at one point where Charles is where Gitzel feels Charles is too romantic about the Soviet Union, and she says, you know, but what about Osip Mandelstam? Because at this point, already in the early 30s, Mandelstam had been in the process of being disappeared and essentially murdered by the state for a poem criticizing Stalin. And I'm off on a tangent here. Forgive me if I've gone too far down into histories that that may seem esoteric, but I'll bring it back by saying they're not esoteric. Um, the questions that America is grappling with today of what it means to sort of have a movement, an interracial movement of um, anti-racism and solidarity against the sort of foundational, brutal, and what Charles calls cannibalistic myth of America, that sort of puts the racial fascination and fixation as its center and as the sort of justification for its utmost brutality. And questions of how to build a movement against that, questions of what role international solidarity plays in terms of sort of each country, questions of what it means when um, a state puts out certain ideologies, and then of course later what it means when a state betrays those ideologies, right? Because as I was writing this, Charles's note is signed May 1936, and I know as a writer um, that probably a few years later from that, Charles himself would be at risk of being disappeared and murdered in a Stalinist purge, simply by virtue of being an American in this period of wild paranoia in the Soviet Union of the late 30s. So there's not it's not a polemic. It's not a book that says, communism good and America bad. There's a point where Gittel says, um, you know, I won't find the exact line right now, but basically where she says, actually, wait, I think I did open to the exact right page, um, where Charles sort of has ghost written a speech about um, about sort of similar things. It's almost it's a tribute to Langston Hughes's time in Moscow and talking about which truly is the land of the free. And and so he says to Gittel after the speech, he's come to a Communist Party meeting with him in Philadelphia. And he says, Nu, was sagst du, Chaverte? So, what do you say, comrades? Charles turned to Gittel. Nit Ärger, Gittel said. Not terrible. Truly, she was the pineapple of politeness, as old Sheridan would have it. No need to flatter, Charles said. So you're a bit didactic. And also, I'm not sure from the idea that the opposite of hideous is hideous. Maybe it's more truthful that everything, maybe it's more truthsome that everything is hideous and everywhere. Charles nodded. Maybe. So that's just sort of a note where the book is, it's not a sort of simple pay on to one single thing, but it does offer that in the way that I have loved reading novels set in different eras. Not to say historical novels as such, because I think even that title can be distancing for folks who frankly have had bad experiences in high school history classes or whatever the case may be that would lead them to think that historical may equal boring or less relevant to our current era or having less to teach us about how to live in 2023. Um, but so what I've loved about novels set in other eras is this opportunity to spend time with the characters as they lived, without me telling them how they should have lived or sort of commenting on how they lived and what they should have known, just to be able to spend time with them as they lived and see where that takes me.
There's this quote, and I can't remember who said it, but there's this quote that people always think that they're living during the climax of history, which I think is so apt to what you're talking about, just all the lessons that we can learn from 100 years ago that we're still very much grappling with today. I also fully plan to use the pineapple of politeness conversation very soon.
And that's from Richard Sheridan's play, I think in sometime in the 1700s. Um, I think the character is Mrs. Malaprop, and
Oh, of course.
the
Of
word
course.
malaprop has now been adopted as a kind of a malapropism,
Malapropism.
where so pineapple of politeness is one of the famous malapropisms.
Huh. I love it. Brooks has a question about verb construction, but I'm gonna have her ask it herself because I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sure.
Oh, I have that in the chat there, but I just was picking up in your reading on just a lot of your verbiage, and I was just wondering if that was a function of the Yiddish language or translation, especially because you're multilingual. You seem to have a lot of knowledge of that, and also the idea of translation and translation, because this is a faux translation, or is that a way for you to just give your characters a particular way of speaking, to make them stand out from other characters. So, it's that's a little more technical
No,
than
it's a
kind of the
yeah.
broad questions we've been speaking about, but I was just wondering about that.
It's a magnificent question. It's a delightful one, and my answer would kind of be yes to all of the above. Um, so verb construction was absolutely central to my sort of real entry into Yiddish and into the book. Um, I remember at the end of my first Yiddish intensive course, which I took with a teacher named Esther Rozhansky, who was a native Yiddish speaker raised in Buenos Aires in a Yiddish speaking community there, and later moved to Tel Aviv. Where she said, we've just begun to scratch the surface. She said at the end of the class, the real magic of Yiddish is found, and she said this in different framing, but is found in its combination words, right? In the way that it combines words to make something utterly new. And this, I think, Yiddish does share in common with German. But of course, it has its own elements there, where these combination words may be a combination of an Aramaic word and a Germanic rooted word, or a Hebrew word and a Slavic rooted word, or a verb. I
Mm.
just opened I opened the book to a random page, and this is page 42. Um, and this is sort of the final section of this scene where it goes, and yo, there was still for Lave, the still small strum of the balalaika, yo, the scent of after Shabbos, yo, wine and candle wax and spiced dirt, and also strumming, yo, all we could do, and then he was away taken from crickets. And that verb there is what
Away
jumped
taken,
out.
take
Away
away.
taken, exactly. Away taken for me it's very much a nod to actual Yiddish. It's both a translation and a translation. Um, I think is weggenimmt. Um, so it would be a single word also. And avec is a word that appears a lot in this book. Avec means away or gone, but also is a way in spoken Yiddish, in idiomatic Yiddish, to say dead. So is avec, it could mean he is dead. And there to tie the circle once more, similar to the way that Langston Hughes uses the word gone in his gorgeous poem, My Friend is Gone, which is sort of a poem about a friend who has died. Um, God, now I can't remember if Hughes's poem is My Friend is Gone or My Friend Went Away, because the Yiddish.
Is it the one that goes, I loved my friend, he went away from me?
He
There's
went away
nothing
from me.
more
Thank
to
you. Yes,
say.
that is. There's nothing more to say. Exactly.
The
That's it.
poem begins soft. The poem ends soft as it
Off
began.
as it
I love
begins.
my
I love
friend.
my friend.
I love
Thank
that
you.
poem.
Beautiful. Wow. Thank you so much for having that on the tip of your tongue. What a gorgeous contribution. And yes, so it is. He went away. But that same usage of went away that Hughes does in that poem so magnificently, I think it is this very beautiful, very moving idiomatic um, way in Yiddish to say this person is dead. But also, it's this word that comes up again and again and again. So in another scene, there is Labe has been taken into an alley by two American police officers who have come into this what we'd now call a gay club, but the word gay didn't exist at that era. There hadn't yet been this sort of fixed creation of the category of homosexual, which is also a fascinating era to live in. And in some ways, again, and again, I'm kind of energized here, but again, the way in which the 20s have a lot to say to our 20s, right? Our current discourse around queerness actually has been a discourse before in American history. Right? There's this false narrative that American history is just a forward march of progress, and it was really, really bad to be gay in 1901, and then a little less bad in 1951, and a little, and now it's great in 2001, and whatever onwards. And actually, that's really not true. In some ways, it was actually safer to be a man who slept with men in 1920, in 1925, than it would have been in 1939. So anyway, but at this point, and this practice of entrapment of sort of undercover police officers going into spaces, into queer spaces, and pretending to be members of the community, and then dragging out whoever touched them as sort of violating laws and acting in perversion, was a practice that sort of ramped up around the end of Prohibition. Um, and so Labe in this scene has been dragged out of crickets by two lawmen, and there's this line where it says, even as from the Jew's mouth hideous sounds continued to emerge, yo, ever playing, and around them there was jewful dancing and silent mirth, and onwards. And so that word ever playing, I don't get to, I ultimately cut a lot of the footnotes. I think at some point there were 300 or 400 of them. By the end, there's only a little over 100. But so ever playing has that same root. In Yiddish, it's wegspielen. So it's that away playing. And something about the notion of playing onwards eternally is connected to the same word of awayness or goneness. And there we have this connection of sort of what is it in music that brings us into the sort of immortal or extramortal. And we could go on and on. So there are a million things like that where the verbs are quite central. Some of them are sort of noted in translation, some of them are noted in the footnotes, some of them aren't. But definitely the question about verb construction is not it's not an insignificant one in terms of how this book came into being, and in terms of what was one of the kind of animating logics. Just this question of, if I follow the verbs, how they're constructed in these Yiddish poems that I love, just asking like what happens to an English language novel that sort of uses verbs and combination words, and some of them real and some of them utterly made up, in a similar way, or not even in a similar way, in a way that leans on the Yiddish original, or leans on sort of Yiddish syntax or Yiddish formulation, again, to see what happens.
Yeah. And just to a slight follow-up to that, when you were writing, did that automatically come? You would get into that writing voice, so you could always do away taken, and you were never writing taken away and have to go back and edit that?
So many mistakes in the early drafts. Mistakes, that I see as mistakes. So for example, in the book, in the sort of English translation, the word which was never ultimately allowed to appear, because there are two different words for what in Yiddish. So there's vos, and there's az. So tell me what you were saying is valid, because in Yiddish it would be tell me that what you were saying. But the first line of the book, after the translator's note, of course, is once there was a child, what was called Reza. And that the construction of that sentence very much mirrors the Yiddish, but only in a later phase did I decide that sort of the what would always replace the which. And then sort of going through the text and be like, oh, here I slipped back into sort of my normal parlance of like, once there was a child who was called Reza, or once there was a place which was called Zatelsk. Whereas in the formulation of the book, both of those have to turn into what. So there were a lot of errors I made that no one else would have flagged as an error unless they were reading very, very closely.
Yeah, I was gonna have my next questions again, and this is like super deep tracks. It's about like your copy editor, your publishing house, and what was their Yiddish background?
Thank you for asking this. They didn't have a Yiddish background. My editor, Jenna Johnson, who is an absolute genius at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, is not Jewish, doesn't speak Yiddish, but reads Walt Whitman once a year, but sort of is in love with language and poetics and the power of language. And it was such a gift to have her as an editor on every level, but including on the level of she would push me again and again to sort of just to make sure that I had the infrastructure intact. If I said, here exactly is why this is happening, and here is why this word is transliterated with an H and this one isn't, and here is, when the Malachim are speaking, here is who can hear them. So on every level, on the linguistic level, on the verb level, on the plot level, she would make sure that I had something behind it. And sometimes she would push and I would say, oh, look at that. There's nothing behind there, right? You push on the fancy words and there's just emptiness. It's just a chasm. And I was like, okay, fine. Those are ones we need to take out in the process of drafting. But it was an incredible gift to work with her. And then it was just a gift to work with the folks at FSG, where the copy editor, I mean, blessings on the copy editor. I sent them a 7-page single-spaced document of the rules I'd invented. And I said in my email, I said, I'm sorry, I don't think this is all of them. I want to name the first copy editor by name here. Their name is Logan Hill, and they took the seven-page letter in such stride and did a brilliant job of even catching points where I had missed, that wouldn't seem as errors to someone reading a standard American English text, but in the world and in the rules I'd created for the book, they would say, actually, is this meant to be which, or is this meant to be what? Right? Is this meant to be going away, or is this meant to be away going? Is this, and so on and so forth. And so the copy editors were brilliant, and it just felt to me, I think the process of creating this book, who knows what sort of life the book will have, what it is having today, where it's floating around the world, who's reading it. But it was such a gift for me to have already in the process of creating this book, any kind of parochial boundarying to be broken down immediately. Right? This is not a book that is sort of for a specific ethnic audience. This is not a book that sort of is only to be in conversation with those who have deep knowledge of or connection to Yiddish. This is a book for folks who are willing to read with open minds and open hearts. And I'll say that as a reader, that's also been one of the incredible gifts of this kind of whatever we call our contemporary era of reading is. But it's been an incredible gift to read novels and fiction that draw from languages in which I don't know a word, from cultures in which I'm not versed, but I'm given this kind of permission to access for the moment of a book, right? For the hours of a book. I think particularly of some of the novelists I've loved, Arundhati Roy, for example, Junot Diaz. Those two in particular came to mind of folks weaving in non-English grammars and words and syntaxes into their English language novels and creating something that sort of for me was breathtaking and heart opening. So the process of creating this book has already been one of this kind of discourse stretching far beyond the bounds of what Yiddish is often allowed to stretch. Right? It's also interesting there, and there are a million tangents I'm going on here, but thank you all for bearing with me. But that Yiddish kind of has no place in the sort of American sphere of study, right? Because on one hand, it's not seen as a third world language. It's not sort of categorized as sort of part of the global South or sort of to be taught in third world curricula. On the other hand, it's also not seen as a European language, right? It's not taught. You're not going to be taught Yiddish poets in a poetry class that focuses on 18th and 19th century European poetry, right? So it kind of falls between the cracks and is sent into this exile of essentially for Jews only, if that. And part of, I say this project, of course, a project that spans half a decade and then obviously more on either end, has a lot of animating logics. But part of it for me was that I'd found this truly life-giving conversation with some of these Yiddish poets, with Jacob Glatstein and Anna Margolin and Rachel Korn and Itzik Manger and Moshe Leib Halpern and Avram Sutzkever and Celia Dropkin. And these are poets that I think I want folks who are interested in poetry, who are interested in language, who are interested in sort of what a poem can do. I'd love if one of the byproducts of this book would be folks saying like, cool, like who might I pick up in translation from these sort of Yiddish poets that are standing in and woven through and mentioned in the book and mentioned in the notes. That's yet another layer of this book.
Well, thank you very much. I have learned more in this conversation than I did in undergrad. Are there any last minute questions for Moriel? Zach says he enjoyed listening to you read some of your story. I think your knowledge of the history really helped bring your characters to life. And I completely agree. I'm really looking forward to diving into this novel.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here. Thanks for spending this Tuesday evening with me. If you're here live, or this, future evening, future evening with these words, if you're watching this sometime in the future.
Thank you very, very much for this, Moriel. This was absolutely wonderful. And one more time, what is your book called? Where can we buy it?
It is Before All the World. It is available wherever one gets books, but preferably, most preferably, if one has the possibility to do so, getting it from your local independent bookstore is always my first choice. And you can do that through one of the sort of conglomerates, IndieBound or Bookshop. But even better than that is to pop into your bookstore and see if they have it. And if they don't have it, ask them if they might consider having it. And then going from there.
Wonderful. Once again, thank you so much for doing this, Moriel. This was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Moriel, do you have any classes coming up with us that we can promote too?
Nothing on the calendar right now, but
Okay.
I'd love to schedule something
be on the lookout
after
for
the
classes with Moriel in the future with us, where you will learn even more than you've learned tonight. All right. Thank you all. Take care. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.